So, and this is Eclipse Foundation very briefly, but so I've been living in Brussels now since 2004, working on various pieces of EU legislation focused on free and open source software. So I worked in various organizations. I'm currently working with Eclipse Foundation. And so Eclipse Foundation is kind of known for hosting the Eclipse IDE and then hosting some Java software, but it's expanded to lots of other software packages now. So it's a project hosting FOSS Foundation. The headquarters is Brussels and 60% of the staff are in Europe. So that makes it the largest code hosting FOSS Foundation in Europe. And then besides hosting software, we also do policy, which is my area. So a lot of the work that we do on policy is moving towards this coalition that we've created called the Open Regulatory Compliance Work Group. I'll put the URL on the screen at the end. But today, what I want to do is I want to give an introduction to the Cyber Resilience Act. And the idea is that we need to target people who have not been getting involved all that much so far, because a lot of the larger organizations have policy people and compliance people, and they know whether they have obligations or not. But then smaller organizations, they may not have been looking to see what their obligations are, and they will possibly never have the staffing necessary. But at least we'd like to get people to have the basic understanding so that they can give feedback on all the materials that are being published by larger organizations like Eclipse Foundation. So the first thing about the Cyber Resilience Act is that the vote and adopting the act in Parliament happened in December 2024, and so the news reported this sometimes as Cyber Resilience Act is now done and enters into force, but the actual obligations do not apply yet. There was no fines for not following the obligations. So we're actually we're here so far on Cyber Resilience Act. So we have the piece of the legal text, but there's a lot left to do before the legislation actually becomes applicable, is the proper term. So a lot of small organizations, when they look at the Cyber Resilience Act, the first question is, am I exempt? Or can I get into one of the categories where I don't have to do anything? So the main categories are the manufacturer is the bigger organizations, the people who are commercializing, and so they have the larger set of obligations. And then the lighter regime is the steward regime, and then there's another regime which doesn't get named, but the word provider is suggested in the Cyber Resilience Act, and these are the ones that might be exempt. So when you look for the exemptions, just to give an example of how complicated it can be to read the regulations sometimes, we find the sentence, only free and open source software made available on the market. And so it sounds like, well, made available on the market is the condition you need to meet. But when you look at the regulation as a whole, the regulation starts off by saying it applies to software that's made available on the market. So then you have to go back and look at the exemption again. And so if it wasn't that first sentence, then you look at the next sentence, and here we have free and open source software that is not monetized. And then we start looking for the definition of monetized. And of course, we don't find the definition. So this is the sort of cyclical work that we have trying to figure out, are we in or are we out? So unfortunately, the conclusion is after, but the funny thing is, that's not even a bug, because the goal of creating exemptions in the Cyber Resilience Act is not to help people get into the exemptions. It's they didn't write the Cyber Resilience Act with the vision of ensuring that if people don't want to comply with it, they can be legally certain that they are not required to comply with it. So this is something we're not going to be able to just ask questions or ask for further documents to be produced, and then it'll become clear how we can escape the Cyber Resilience Act. So another example would be that there's a clause in the Cyber Resilience Act that sometimes when people read it, they find, I can declare that my software is unfinished and therefore I don't have to apply the Cyber Resilience Act. But unfinished software is defined as software made available for a limited period of time. And unfortunately for our software, once we put it online, that's it, it's there forever. So it's pretty certain that we can't rely on that idea. So in general, if you want to avoid having the manufacturer obligations of the Cyber Resilience Act, the things you have to avoid are charging for the software, charging for support beyond covering costs, and processing personal data beyond what's necessary. The personal data one, sometimes it reads a little bit strange, but it's basically if you're using the software not to get money out of people, but to scoop up lots of data that can be used for some other commercials. So it's like if you're being commercial in an indirect way through processing lots of people's data. Then also the charging for support is an interesting one to look at, because there's this notion of beyond covering costs, and this becomes complicated because how do you define the costs of providing the support? To what extent, how many of the actions involved in creating the structure to provide the support would fit into the definition? So this, once again, it's not very easy to be certain that you've escaped from the Cyber Resilience Act. So sometimes it's better not to try to escape from it. And then there's also, for academia, there was a lot of talk during the Cyber Resilience Act of having an exemption for the public sector. And so the exemption, it got introduced and changed and modified in many ways. At the end, it's not very broad, really. They didn't exactly bring in, or they didn't keep an exemption, a general exemption for the public sector, but rather they clarified that the delivery of a public service is never commercial, and they clarified that when a public sector body distributes software internally, then that's not on the market. And so, actually, maybe I should just briefly say why on the market is important. So the notion of on the market is that your software is available to others. And then you have a difference here between what if you have two public sector organizations that are legally separate versus two entities that are merged into a single entity. Why would the Cyber Resilience Act apply to one and not the other? And so this is why they brought in a way for different departments within the government to share bits of software without having to follow the Cyber Resilience Act. So the three topics I wanted to cover, and the first one is only very brief, so I go straight to that, is this concept that I'm trying to throw into pretty much all my presentations, that policy is the new licensing. So for a long time, the free and open source ecosystem created its own legal foundations and its own legal structures by drafting our licenses, by sometimes drafting contributor licensing agreements, a little bit of work on trademarks, a small amount of work on association law, just so you can set up all these nonprofits. But it was pretty much always an internal thing. And that was nice and comfortable, and it also gave us a lot of control over the timeline. But what has changed now is that the obligations that we are facing, or the structures that we need to create, are dictated by regulation. And so anyone who was interested in licenses in the past 20 years or 30 years, if you want to continue doing the same type of work, if you want to continue defining and making it easier for the legal structures within our ecosystem to exist, then policy is now the venue where all this is happening. So with that said, back to things that are specific to the Cyber Resilience Act, the idea of looking for exemptions, it probably comes from, like, we have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction when regulations are imposed from the outside. You look first for, how do I ignore this, or how do I make sure this is not something that affects me? And so I think that maybe this is something that we have to change our mindset, and rather than trying to do the minimal amount of work to comply and tick the boxes and make those people go away, maybe we should actually try and do a little bit more and see how we can actually benefit from the work that we put into this. So my point here would be that complying with the Cyber Resilience Act in a very formal way might take a certain amount of work. But if you really try to do the bare minimum, then it'll be an amount of work, and the actual benefit it produces will be quite small. If we end up doing a little bit more and try to focus on creating a system that actually improves cybersecurity in our software, then we might find that it's not much more work, but then we actually get some real benefits rather than just ticking boxes and finding this to be tedious work. So the four main reasons I would say for why we should do a little bit more. One is that between the three different categories, manufacturers, stewards, and then these providers of software, it might be true that the providers of software don't have obligations formally under the Cyber Resilience Act. However, most people who write software, one of the big motivations is you want lots of people to use your software. And so for the manufacturers then to do all this compliance work, it can often be a lot more difficult for them because they're a few steps removed from the actual developers and designers and people who know the software very well. And so while on one hand it can be quite annoying for the developers to think that they have to do some free work that then is going to be benefiting somebody else who's commercializing the software, it's beneficial if you want people to be using your software. And so we have to find ways to make this commercially useful as well. But the first thing is, if you want larger entities to commercialize your software and people to use your software, then it may be beneficial to do some voluntary compliance work for the CRA. So this can be basic things like providing an SBOM, like providing documentation on what is your security procedure, or where should people send security issues, or who can be contacted about security problems. So the first thing is that we can make our software more attractive to other entities by doing some voluntary compliance work, or by helping out with compliance work. The second thing is that, as I started off the presentation showing, we're not really sure about the situations when you do and when you don't have obligations. So sometimes it can be quite unclear if we really fit into an exemption, or if we can really be a steward rather than a provider, or vice versa. So it might be, just to avoid surprises, it might be better to assume that we do, or one day we might have to do the larger part of compliance, rather than try to focus on trying to do the minimum now. The third thing is that the people in the European Commission, when they created this regulation, they made it very clear that they want to improve cybersecurity. And so the thing is, if the regulation gets implemented and everyone finds ways to tick boxes and do the minimum, then in a few years' time, the Commission is going to look at the situation again and say, well, cybersecurity didn't actually improve, therefore there's a good chance they'll come with more regulation. And so this is why I think we have to work on something that I call enthusiastic compliance. It's better to actually show them that we're not just making these SBOMs because somebody said we have to have X, Y, Z. If we actually make a useful SBOM, and then make useful tools that can process them, and find some standardized way to show people how to improve their security procedures, then we actually get better cybersecurity, and that's good, because it makes people like the European Commission happy, and they're not going to come back with further regulation. But then, as I have in point 4, it's also good to have better cybersecurity. Why not? These are, just because the idea came from a government body doesn't mean that we have to do the opposite. So, and I remember, I think on the next slide I forgot to finish the points, so just so nobody thinks that I was surprised. But on this slide, so the manufacturer's obligations. Now I'm kind of keeping this quite concise, because there are a lot of things still being defined for the Cyber Resilience Act, and that's what I'm going to get into next. But just in general, the manufacturers have the obligations to perform risk assessments and security procedures, to provide security updates, and these two obligations, or sets of obligations, will come into force. Well, the fines for them will become applicable in December 2027, but then already in September 2026, there will be vulnerability response and reporting obligations that will become applicable. So that's for the manufacturers. Then for stewards, the main obligation is to cooperate with market surveillance, and the next word should be authorities. And so each individual member state will have a market surveillance authority, which is monitoring the compliance with the Cyber Resilience Act. And if they send an email, or if they contact a project steward, then you're obliged to cooperate with them. So it's not really clear how much work this will entail, or whether how active the market surveillance authorities will be. There are people who are worried that this will turn into quite a large obligation, like the DMCA in America, and people will be overwhelmed by having to reply to all these emails. That's possible, but it could also be that projects almost never get contacted by the market surveillance authorities, except maybe when there's a big cybersecurity incident. The other obligations of the stewards are, in theory, pretty much the same as manufacturers, except that then at the very end there's a clause that says, however, if stewards do not fulfill these obligations, there will be no fine. So all the other obligations the stewards have are mostly, well, it's not really an obligation if it doesn't have a fine to back it up. So there are still some parts that are unclear. So, for example, there's an obligation for stewards to put in place a security policy. Now, once again, this concept of put in place, well, what does that mean? Does that mean you write it down, or does that mean you enforce it, or does that mean you inform the developers of it? this is not very clear, and we're still talking with the European Commission to try and ask them to clarify what that means. So the idea of putting in place a cybersecurity policy is something that stewards may have to do, although we're still trying to figure out who will have to do that and what they would have to do. So then just I said I wouldn't go into the details of manufacturers and steward obligations, but just to give you an idea. So steward obligations, there are various obligations. One of them is what to do when you have an actively exploited vulnerability. And in this case, then it depends on what type of steward you are. Are you doing all four of these, or one or two of them? And then depending on what actions or what relationship you have with software users, you'll have a varying set of obligations. So I thought it was good to include this slide just to show that it's not a simple, you're a steward, you have these 7 obligations. There is some there are different categories within the stewards, and there are multiple things that you have to take a look at. So it's something that we should probably be taking a look at earlier, rather than finding actually when there is a security problem and then you get contacted by a market surveillance authority. So on one hand, this is to show why it's important to take this seriously and to spend some time looking at it. On the other hand, I have to pass on a story that in Brussels last week there was a huge conference, and there's lots of people talking about policy, and somebody shared the story that they began working on export controls in 1999. And so export controls are whether you can export a certain piece of software from your country to whatever other country. And they spent approximately 10 years gathering the export controls of all the different countries in the world to figure out who can share software with which other countries in the world. And by the time they completed this, nobody cared. It was the document. Nobody reads it. Everyone just shares the software through whatever mechanism, the security and the export controls. They get pretty much ignored. So on one hand, my message is take a look at the CRA and give it a bit of time, because it's actually quite complex and it does affect you. On the other hand, other people thought the same about their important projects, and it didn't turn out to be the same. So then the second point number 2 out of the 012 list, the second point is what is still happening with the CRA. So before 2024, we had 2.5 years of work with the European Parliament and Commission and the Council, trying to get them to make changes to the Cyber Resilience Act to make it less difficult to work with for free and open source software. But the thing is, once the regulation is finished, then there's a lot of things in the regulation about what you have to, what the government and what the Commission has to do to help people with compliance. And so one thing is there are standards, and so standards, I didn't understand them at first because I have a technical background, and I think of data format standards and I think of standards. But standards in this sense are procedures for complying with regulations. So for example, the Cyber Resilience Act, the first obligation is that you can only publish software if it contains no known exploitable security vulnerabilities. And so there's 5 different words in that sentence that you could pick apart and figure out, how do I know that this applies, or how do I know that this is actually my situation? So there's 44 different obligations that are like that, and the European Commission is getting standards bodies to draft standards to explain to people what they can do in order to be confident they have complied with these short one-sentence obligations. So standards work is ongoing. Actually, that's so some of the standards are meant to be finished in August. I believe they're delayed, and then more standards will be finished in October 2026. And I think a lot of people suspect they'll be delayed as well. There's guidance documents about free and open source software. There's guidance about remote services, which are exempted from the Cyber Resilience Act. Then there are special categories, especially pieces of security software that have extra requirements. There's attestations, and this is a formal way. So if you do voluntary compliance, you can put this into an attestation, and then people upstream can say that, look, we've done our due diligence, because for each of these pieces of software we have an attestation from the developer saying that they've reviewed the security. And then we have SBOMs, which are actually extremely small and not really detailed in the Cyber Resilience Act. And so on one hand, you might think that it's a one-line SBOM is enough, and for the moment it might be, but there is possibility to create an implementing act where the Commission would then have broaden the requirements for the SBOMs. So the point is that the Cyber Resilience Act is still changing. The Cyber Resilience Act is also being changed then by related pieces of legislation. So the standards regulation, the new legislative framework, which defines a lot of the terminology, and then the rest of the world has a lot of regulation that we're going to have to try and comply with at the same time. So we're trying to talk to the Commission about all these different things, and we're struggling for resources. Sebastian Reibel, I don't know if people have already talked to Sebastian Reibel, he's also in Brussels. There's about 10 of us doing free and open source software policy in Brussels. So it's myself and Sebastian and a few others, and we meet up and we have a mailing list, and we try and get a lot of this work done. But this is it's a challenge to try and deal with the current legislation about EU funding, upcoming legislation about public sector fast strategies, EU support for the private sector, AI legislation, and market regulation and security. So that's our to-do list for 2026, and what I'm showing is just one of these. And there's also stuff I couldn't categorize. But with that, I have to pass the stage over.